I'm Federica Carugati from Stanford University. This is the third of 3 mini lectures on the political economy of ancient Greece. In previous videos, I argued that ancient Greece is a valuable comparative case study for students of political economy and institutional development. I also summarized some of the most exciting work in this fast-growing interdisciplinary field on topics such as democratization, the institutional sources of economic growth, and the development of constitutional and legal structures. In this final video, I discuss some of my own work in progress on a hot topic in political economy, the emergence of inclusive institutions. The main goal of this work, and of my broader research agenda, is the following. The ancient Greek city-states, and particularly Athens, managed to deliver important public goods, including stability, peace, democracy, economic development, low inequality, in the absence of contemporary liberal values and institutions. Investigating and understanding the normative and institutional arrangements that supported public goods delivery in ancient Greece can therefore provide an alternative paradigm for development, a paradigm that can help us think about institutional development in countries that have little hope and perhaps little interest in embracing or conforming to the prevalent liberal paradigm. So going back to the question of inclusion, much recent scholarship in the fields of comparative law and political economy has highlighted the role of inclusive institutions in a country's road to development. More specifically, studies like Elkins, Ginsberg, and Melton from 2009, North, Wallace, and Weingas, also from 2009, and Acemoglu and Robinson in 2012, have established important correlations between inclusion and indicators of constitutional stability, democracy, and economic growth. However, in all these contributions, the mechanisms driving the emergence of inclusive institutions remain rather vague. Elkins, Ginsberg, and Melton take constitutions as given. Acemoglu and Robinson speak of historical conjunctures and virtuous cycles. North, Wallace, and Weingas speak of doorstep conditions and open access. More granular empirical evidence for the emergence of inclusive institutions comes from the early modern period, and particularly from England. The paradigm here suggests that political inclusion, that is citizenship, is a precondition for the emergence of other forms of inclusion and access to public goods. The process is perhaps best captured in North, Wallace, and Weingas' incorporation of citizens, where political rights yield access to rule of law, infrastructure, education, labor protection, and social insurance. The evidence from ancient Athens suggests instead that political inclusion is not a necessary precondition for the extension of access to other institutions and public goods. It also suggests that known political inclusion can similarly promote democratic stability and economic prosperity. And finally, it suggests that inclusion is a gradual process, the product of a trade-off between competing demands. I focus on ancient Athens for 3 reasons. First, as argued in an earlier video, Athens was very successful. It was the highest performing of all the Greek city-states, and it was also the most democratic. All adult males were eligible to participate in the polis's public institutions, which included the assembly, its agenda-setting organ, the council or boule, the popular courts, and numerous boards of magistrates. Institutional change and development there was therefore compatible with both democratic stability and economic growth. Second, Athens is by far the best documented of all the city-states. And finally, compared to modern and other early modern cases, Athens' smaller size and relative institutional simplicity make for a cleaner case for analysis. So what happened in ancient Athens? In the period I analyze, which is the 4th century BCE, Athens extended meaningful forms of institutional access to new actors in the realms of law, the economy, and society. Actors included foreigners, resident aliens, and even slaves. Forms of inclusion range from the extension of litigation rights to land grants. If the Athenians extended access to institutions to new actors, they did not, however, extend citizenship. In fact, access to political institutions remained restricted to sons and daughters of Athenian citizens, which is a remarkably strict criterion even for a pre-modern society. The reason for this trade-off, I suggest, emerged from the conflicting demands of post-war political stability and economic growth in the context of limited resources. The trade-off was sustainable because it was in the interest of all parties, that is, both citizens and non-citizens. To contextualize the process whereby Athens established more inclusive institutions, I must take a step back and briefly address the challenges that the city-state faced before the process that I discussed today began. As I mentioned earlier, Athens was quite successful as a city-state, and its success lasted for about 200 years, roughly from 508 to 322 BCE, which encompasses both the 5th and the 4th centuries. But the institutional underpinnings of Athens' performance changed dramatically between the 5th and the 4th century. In the 5th century, the polis was a stable, prosperous imperial democracy. But towards the end of the 5th century, largely because of military defeats, this equilibrium was shattered. Democracy collapsed, leading to a protracted period of instability that culminated in a civil war. Moreover, Athens' loss in the long Peloponnesian War against Sparta translated into the loss of the empire and most of the resources previously accumulated. In my book, I provide a comprehensive account of the institutional sources of Athens' recovery from the crisis. But for my purposes here, a brief summary must suffice. In the aftermath of the civil war, the Athenians established a new democratic constitutional structure that made it much harder to pass or modify laws, enhancing the credibility of the Deimos' commitments. The reforms expressed the Deimos' commitment to refrain from elite expropriation, but also their commitment to forms of redistribution that benefited sub-elite actors, first and foremost, pay for public service, like assembly attendance. But in the absence of the empire, and in the context of very scarce resources, the constitution created a big problem. Where were the Athenians to find new sources of revenue? The evidence suggests that in the course of the subsequent 4th century, the Athenians turned to their natural resources, particularly the Laurian silver mines and the harbor of Piraeus, and began to exploit them more efficiently. But in order to do so, they had to provide incentives for those actors that were primarily involved in such exploitation. These were, by and large, foreigners, resident aliens, and slaves. Incentives came in the form of land grants, mining rights, and litigation rights, among others. Here I want to focus on the extension of litigation rights, which will highlight a set of problems that the extension of inclusion may create in a polity. So in the middle of the 4th century, the Athenians created a new set of tribunals, the so-called dicae emporicae, or commercial cases, which featured 3 striking departures from common Athenian legal practice. First, of course, non-citizens had standing in these courts. Second, the evidence is contested, but it seems that in these courts, litigants could expect a speedy resolution of the dispute. Third, the state played a somewhat greater role in enforcement by making available things like pre-trial bail and post-trial detention. It is important to note, however, that even in these cases, the state played only a minimal role in enforcement, and that the state did provide the prison and sanction the arrest, but the thorny business of physically taking someone to prison remained the responsibility of the private litigant in Athens' largely decentralized system of coercion. The creation of the dicae emporicae raises a number of questions about the incentives that the actors had to play by the rules. Why would an Athenian citizen choose to enforce a foreigner's right even when a verdict went against the interest of a fellow citizen and in favor of a foreigner? Why would a foreign merchant choose to resolve a dispute in an Athenian tribunal, especially if the dicae emporicae featured, as some classicists maintain, an all-Athenian jury? And why would foreigners not demand political inclusion as a guarantee that their rights would not be revoked in the future? The compromise, the fact that the Athenians extended access to legal institutions but not to political institutions, I suggest, was in the interest of all parties. By restricting access to political institutions, citizens maintained a high degree of homogeneity in participatory decision-making. But non-citizens were also well off under this arrangement. First, the constitution that I discussed earlier, a constitution where commitments made by law were hard to change, gave reasonable guarantees to non-citizens that privileges bestowed one day would not be revoked the next. Second, by using Athenian courts, non-Athenians avoided the costs of creating a whole new structure. To conclude, the Athenian evidence illustrates a path to creative inclusive institutions that differs from the path of early modern England. In Athens, inclusion was a gradual and instrumental process that did not begin with the extension of full-blown citizenship and political inclusion. The evidence from Athens urges us to think of inclusion as a trade-off, and thinking of inclusion as a trade-off enables us to highlight the complex and high-stakes bargains that creative inclusive institutions may demand.